Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future. For today's episode, which is part 3 of our series with Shannon Vallor, talking about the history of thinking about thinking machines, we are discussing a truly great novel, which was the basis for a very well-known film, but we're interested in the book. Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? For this episode, Shannon, we're talking about a book which I think we should probably admit is best known as the basis of a film. The film is Blade Runner, but we're not going to be focusing on Blade Runner. We're going to be focusing on Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was published in 1968. So that's 14 years before the movie. And I think it's a more interesting thing than the movie. It's a very, very weird book. If I had to say what it was about, and I'm going to ask you if I've got this right. If I had to say what it was about, essentially, it seems to me it is a novel about a world, an imagined world, in which the line between the human, natural, organic on the one hand, and the mechanical, artificial, inorganic on the other, has become incredibly hard to draw. And yet at the same time, it's the only thing that matters. Somehow, what matters to human beings is to distinguish themselves from essentially androids, but actually from the world of the artificial. And they've lost the ability to do that. Is that right?
I think that's as good a summary as any. I think there's another dimension of the story which, to me, is very central and gets very minimal treatment in the movie, which is the loss of contact with nature and the psychological damage that that has wreaked on the human family. And so it is about the intrusion of the artificial upon the natural, but it's also about the deficit of the natural and the organic, and the perception that the intrusion is a replacement for something that has left a pretty big hole in the human psyche that the artificial is not filling. At least to me, that seems to be a very central theme of the book, and that hole has to do with the capacity for empathy that runs as a thread throughout the book in a way that is harder to pull out of the film.
Yeah, it's definitely, when you read it, for anyone who hasn't read it or people who are going to go on and read it, I don't think this is a plot spoiler. There's quite a lot in it about, not just about pets, but about very specific kinds of pets. Goats, for instance. If you haven't read this book, you might be surprised to discover there's quite a lot in it about goats. And how does one distinguish between a real living goat and a very, very convincing artificial goat? So we'll come on to all of that because it does run, when we talk about the natural or the organic, this is running across the animal world. And indeed, not just the animal world. There's also a question about plant life too. We should say it is, I don't know if this is the right word for it, it is set in a post-apocalyptic version of Earth. So this is a planet which has colonized other planets, including Mars, because Earth has become relatively uninhabitable. Something terrible has happened, something nuclear has happened. And so the people who are left on Earth, it's a pretty unhealthy place to be. But then something's gone terribly wrong on the colonies too, because the replicants, the androids, who were the perk of the colonizers, go to Mars, in the words of the song, it's not a great place to raise your kids, but you'll have android help. But then the androids rebel. So it's a post-apocalyptic world. But 4 years after he wrote or published this novel, Philip K. Dick gave what is now quite a famous speech. I think it was to a sci-fi convention in 1972. It's called The Android and the Human. And it's about that theme of this novel, which is the increasing difficulty of telling apart what is naturally human from what is artificial. But he's writing about 1972 California. But he's writing about it as though it were a kind of post-apocalyptic landscape. If you read this speech, he's describing a world that seems terrifying and in which he thinks that that line has already broken down. So this is clearly a sci-fi book. It's a sort of, it's set in a very speculative future. But he seems to be arguing, even from the late 60s, early 70s, that this is already happening, And this is pre the digital revolution. This is pre all of that. This, this is the analog world. But he thinks even in the analog world, the line between the human and the mechanized version of what human beings do is already breaking down.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of possible things to speculate about why he might have perceived that. And it is funny, right, to think about that in 1972, which, many people now look back on with a great deal of nostalgia and think, oh, back in 1972, before climate change felt like an inevitable force coming down upon us, and when it, still felt like the future might be one that would allow for the greater flourishing of life rather than diminished opportunities for organic life. And yet in 1972, I think you have a couple of things. Of course, you do have the growing worry of a nuclear holocaust, but you also have the aftermath of the Second World War and the merger of industrial and military powers in a way that people in the late 60s and 1970s were becoming increasingly concerned about. And so there is a theme in the book about the mechanization of the human personality and the pushing of the human personality into kind of mechanized amoral patterns of behavior. So there's this cultish religion that has taken hold of humans called Mercerism. And there's a moment where the character of Mercer is describing to the main character of the novel, Deckard, who, people who've seen the film will remember the Harrison Ford character, Rick Deckard, who appears in this book as well. And Deckard is being told by Mercer that you're going to have to do things that are wrong over and over again. And that Mercer himself has been trapped into this loop of doing things that are wrong over and over again. And I did wonder, as I read that, I thought about the mechanization of warfare, the industrialization of a world that no longer feels like there's much room for human agency and judgment. And that was something that philosophers and sociologists like Jacques Ellul were already speaking about in 1964 in the Technological Society, where he talked about the rule of efficiency taking over from ethics and morality and becoming, in a sense, its replacement. So I wonder if that's part of what's driving Dick's thinking here about the kind of loss of the organic and natural, not just in the physical sense of, let's say, increasing urbanization and the rise of concrete jungles and in the cities and the loss of parkland. And I'm sure those were all things on his mind. I'm sure Carson's Silent Spring was also in the background there. But I also think he's talking about organic human agency increasingly becoming mechanized by larger social structures. And that was something that was certainly already in the intellectual zeitgeist of the time.
Yeah, I'd say that speech, it's kind of countercultural. It feels very of its time. And some of the sexual politics in it have not dated well. There's quite a lot in it about his view of young women and how they are the only truly liberated ones. But it's, to be honest, I think the word for it is a little creepy. But it's also countercultural in the sense that he does perceive this pervasive loss of agency across work, across communication. Things are becoming automated and mechanized, and human beings are losing the ability to think for themselves. That's what he's come to believe. So it's, it doesn't require the digital revolution for that to be a established tradition of thought. It comes out of the Frankfurt School. It comes out of a lot of writing in the 1960s. And it has that sort of hippie quality to it in the way he writes about it. Also kind of Hunter S. Thompson quality to it too, that the only truly free people are the junkies and the petty criminals and these young women that he quite fancies, who are somehow sticking it to the man by ignoring the cops and leading these rootless lives. And all of that has really not dated well. I mean, it doesn't read like something that anyone would write now, actually. And yet, he also says, I can see where this is going. And at one point he says, we're heading into a world, you won't believe me, he'll say, but we're heading into a world where there are going to be police cars without cops in them. They're going to be driving around, and it sounds incredible, but this is where we're heading. And I noticed today, as we record this, as periodically happens, the Tesla share price just took a massive hike up. And I'm always curious, what is the latest bogus news story that's driving up the Tesla share price? And it's the rollout of the robo-taxis, which they're promising again are just round the corner. And so this 1972 countercultural Hunter S. Thompson, let's stick it to the man by taking lots of drugs document is also weirdly prophetic.
Absolutely. The book is prophetic in ways that really surprised me as well. So one of the chapters that I was inspired to write in my latest book, the title of the chapter is The Empathy Box, because it was inspired by this technology that features centrally in the book that humans have come to rely upon in order to experience empathy and fellow feeling. So it's this box that you literally grab on with both hands and are suddenly, electronically transported into a state of emotional communion with others who are using the empathy box, who are all together joined in this struggle that the character of Mercer is undergoing. And so everyone is sort of feeling this struggle together and identifying with Mercer, but through Mercer also identifying with one another. And there's another character in the book, J.R. Isidore, who also appears in the film. And, his character is portrayed as, sort of pathetic and lonely, but sweet and genuinely pure of heart. And there's a moment in the book where Isidore is talking about the empathy box, and he says, it's the way you stop being alone. And of course, it's a world that, as you mentioned, is no longer particularly hospitable to life. So almost all the animals and insects are dead. It's unclear, actually, in the book whether any organic creatures other than humans really exist, humans and probably microbes. So there's lots of animals in the book, but it's clear that most of the animals are fakes. And even the ones that appear to be real, at some point it becomes unclear in the story whether they really are or whether they're just more expensive fakes. But humans have also been affected by this, and it's clear that their reproductive capacities have been damaged by radioactivity. And the population's now very sparse on Earth. So there are these kind of concentrated areas in the cities, which is, of course, something you would get from seeing the film Blade Runner. But what you don't get so much is how unpopulated much of the planet is. And so Isidore's character lives out in one of these suburbs that is essentially abandoned, in a building that's essentially abandoned. But even the people who live in the cities are clearly emotionally alone. And yet they have these empathy boxes that they rely on like a drug to feel connected to one another. And going back to this point about the book's prescience, right? I'm thinking today about all the newspaper articles you see about the loneliness crisis, about how there are more people than ever and people are all digitally connected, but somehow people, both young and old, are lonelier than ever. And what is it that we're being sold in order to address this loneliness? Are we being sold more community activities? Are we being sold new parks to bring us together again? Are we being sold the reinvestment in the physical infrastructure of community? No. We're being sold chatbots that will tell us they love us, chatbots that will be our therapists and comfort our emotional ills, chatbots that will be our empathy boxes and allow us to feel connection when we've lost the ability to feel connection with other humans. And then I'm reading, once again, this book. I'd read it as a young person, but hadn't been back to it in quite some time. And I was just struck by, okay, here we are with our empathy boxes. And it's how we stop being alone.
The other thing that the characters in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep have more or less on tap is artificially induced psychological states to suit their mood. So Deckard is married. It's not a great marriage, let's say. It feels like a marriage lacking in a certain amount of empathy. And his wife is stuck at home, and he's, tells her to cheer herself up. She should program a little bit of euphoria. And at one point, I think she says something like, actually, I'm going to program some really deep depression because that's what I feel like. That's actually in a weird sort of way going to cheer me up. I'm in the mood for really deep gloom. You turn the dial. There's literally a dial, I think it's described, and you turn the dial. So you've got one box on which you can turn a dial, and you can set it for euphoria or even just mild pleasure or neutrality or a nice bout of melancholia. And on the other hand, if you actually want to connect with another human being, I picture it like those machines in the gym, that you hold on to and they measure your heart rate. That's exactly what we're looking at here. But in this case, it plugs you into other human hearts, other human consciousnesses. But it's fake. It's fake.
It's all fake. And it's remarkable because that other technology, so there's the empathy box, but then there's what you just described, which is the mood organ. And it has these numbered settings that everyone has memorized. So everyone knows what emotion or mood 143 is, right? It might be, jubilation with just a little frisson of fear, right? And so you've got these incredibly detailed emotional maps memorized and paired with numbers that you just dial in for yourself. And there are a lot of people in Silicon Valley right now working to try to build such a thing and would absolutely see that as a great leap forward for humanity, to be able to allow you to dial your emotions by phone. Just pull out your app, your mood organ app, and press 143 and get exactly that feeling that you're missing right now. And it's fake, but there will be people, even people who don't have something to sell, who will tell you, well, what difference does it make as long as it's what I need? And I hear that all the time.
Yeah, I was going to say that is the theme of the book. I say it's fake, but it's also real in the same way that the artificial is real. The word artificial is so interesting because it both means fake and it means real. An artificial leg is not a not real leg. It's a real thing. It's just not an organic or natural thing. And that is the theme of this book. And the central plot is not about how to distinguish real human emotions from fake human emotions, although that does come into it. But it's about how to distinguish the human from the android, the human from, as they're called, the replicant, these androids who have come back from the colonies and seem to pose a threat to life on Earth. And they have been designed in such a way at this point in the evolution of technology that they are very, very hard to distinguish from actual humans. And yet, as I said, it's essential for the humans to make the distinction, partly because it's thought these creatures threaten them, they will kill them, but also because it's part of human self-validation. If we can't tell ourselves apart from these creatures, what are we? So Descartes' job is to kill replicants. And in order to be able to kill them, he first of all has to know who are the replicants and who aren't, because the risk of his line of work is you might kill a human thinking it's a replicant, or you might let a replicant off thinking it's a human. So the setup of the book, it more or less begins with Descartes applying to a series of human-like things that he encounters a test which is designed to distinguish the human from the android. And I think it's called the Voigtkampf, one of those. Sounds impressive. Sounds like the sort of thing it might be called. And essentially the person taking the test, or the thing taking the test, is asked a series of questions. And then there's a machine that measures the response, the body's response. And in this way, we are able to tell, in theory, who is human and who is not. What kind of a test is this test? How do you read it? How do you understand it?
So that's the really interesting thing, is the test is very clearly in the book an empathy test. And it's not an intelligence test at all. In fact, there's a backstory about how the Voigt-Kampf test evolved after the replicants or Andes had eventually evaded the initial tests that had been used to discriminate between human and android. Much like we keep building AI tools that generate, let's say, plagiarized content that we then build an AI tool to detect, which then you can train an AI tool to beat the detector, and it just becomes an endless game of whack-a-mole. So you've got this Voigt-Kampf test that is the latest test on the market that is supposedly impossible for the androids to defeat. And what the test looks at particularly is the emotional responses that the test subjects have to the suffering of animals or non-human creatures. So when the Rachel character, who people who are familiar with the film will remember, the femme fatale android character Rachel, when she's tested by Deckard, she has the right apparent physiological responses to a number of the scenarios that involve the killing or harming of humans. But the responses are delayed or missing when the scenarios involve the killing of a dog or a bug. And so this has become the new bright line, right? This capacity to identify with the other. So I think that's another theme of the book that's really interesting. Not just the capacity to identify with those like you, but the capacity to identify and suffer with and care for the things that are not like you. And so, of course, the humans have this capacity with respect to biological forms of life that are not their own, or at least some of them do, although there's some suggestions that it's declining, and that might also be contributing to the ability of the test to work. But the humans that have retained this capacity to identify with organic life, particularly sentient creatures, but even spiders, which is another animal that plays a key role in the book, those humans still can't identify with the androids. They can't feel, or at least it seems that they don't, because they're hunting them down and killing them. So there's this question of how far does your empathy extend? It will extend to an animal, but it will not extend to one of the replicants. And there's a point in the book where Deckard becomes troubled by the fact that he appears to be developing empathy towards the replicants, who themselves, it's unclear whether the replicants have any true capacity for empathy at all. And there's one reading of the book for me that suggests that they simply are biologically incapable of empathy. But a more interesting reading for me is that their empathy is blocked by their anger, because there's a whole other narrative in the book about the treatment of the replicants and the rage they carry. And that's something that comes out in the film as well, that there's this deep anger that the replicants have, particularly over the fact that they are seen as lower on the hierarchy of moral concern than dogs and insects. There's a point in the book where the Roy Batty character says insects are sacrosanct. And I think it's meant to be heard with kind of deep sense of bitterness and sarcasm.
Yeah, what have they got that we haven't got? And as you describe it, it is really complicated, actually, because there are so many ways in which this test can go wrong. I think a lot of people reading it immediately feel there's something a bit weird about this test, because to be human, it assumes you feel empathy with non-human creatures. And that's not true of all humans. Maybe in this world, it has become increasingly true. But it's also the case that the human world is very hierarchical. So Isidore, as you mentioned, it's not just that he's sort of sweet and hopeless. He's clearly damaged. He's been damaged by the event. It's possibly that he's suffering from some kind of radiation sickness.
And it's given him sort of cognitive decline.
Yeah, and he's classified as not subhuman, but a lot lower down the hierarchy than the humans who would, for instance, be allowed to utilize and apply this test. And there's not much empathy with Isidore in this book. So human-to-human empathy is limited. Human-to-animal empathy is assumed as a test of the human, but presumably some humans don't have it. And then, as you say, in a world in which human and android, the line is becoming blurred, human-to-android sympathy may well be growing. And Deckard, whose job is to kill these things, quite a lot of it is about how you do that and how you keep reminding yourself that they're not human. There's a great bit which is about pronouns, right? Do you or don't you call them it? And he keeps sort of slipping in and out of the need to call them it. There's a less great bit, a slightly creepier bit in the spirit of the 1972 speech. Do you or don't you sleep with them? He gets conflicting advice. On the one hand, someone says, if you're going to do the line of work you do, sleep with them first, get it out of your system, and then you can kill them. The other possibility is if you sleep with them, you might develop feelings for them. It's pretty late 60s in its sensibilities. But there's nothing straightforward about the test. It seems flawed on almost every level. And yet it's being used to establish the one thing that matters, in some ways the only thing that matters.
And it's interesting that there's no real larger story about why it matters or why the humans think it matters. And again, this comes back to this really interesting element that I would have loved the film to be able to say more about, which is the obsession that the humans in the story have for owning real animals. And if they can't afford a real animal, and again, it's unclear whether anyone actually owns a real animal anymore, but many people think they do. But people like Deckard, people on a public servant's salary, can only afford animals that they know to be fake. But even that is something that they get comfort from. So the title comes from the electric sheep that lives on the roof of Deckard's apartment. And despite the fact that he's bitter about not being able to afford a real sheep or a goat or a horse or anything else, or even a little toad would make him happy if it were real. But even though he can't afford that, he needs to have this bond with an animal and something to care for, even though he knows it's fake. And this is something that isn't peculiar to Deckard. There's a whole industry of generating fake animals for people or selling them animals that they can believe are perhaps rare organic specimens. But why? What is it about this capacity to bond with a non-human animal that has become so central to society in this post-apocalyptic world? I think there's a reflection here on our sort of natal bond with other life on this planet, our need for it. And if you thought people's obsession with animals was intense from living on the internet, where the cat is notoriously, the thing that a computer will recognize before it can recognize anything else, because there are more cats on the internet than images of people, right? But if you think people are obsessed with pets and domestic care of animals now, I mean, this is the future that Dick is telling us about, where it's almost the only thing that gives people any sense of purpose and status and kind of a will to live. And as we move into the sixth mass extinction on this planet, I think it's another way in which this book is really prescient to ask us the question, how important is the existence and shared community with other forms of life to the stability of the human psyche? And can we actually live and continue to flourish in a world without biodiversity, a world where other forms of life might be increasingly rare, even if we continue to go on?
I also take it in part to be a kind of satire of men's relationships with their cars, because the one person in this story I think we know is real is Deckard's wife. I don't think there's any moment where he doubts that his wife is human. So there is a genuine person there in proximity to him with whom he could experience sympathy, empathy, physical contact. And he's pretty indifferent to that. And he spends his time looking through animal catalogs, trying to find the latest model, hoping and believing that it might be real. It might be something with which he can bond. But like you say, I think we're meant to suspect actually he's just being sold a more and more sophisticated version of the thing that he has already. The real goat, is the real goat really real? And there's no real way of knowing because they've been so skillfully manufactured. But here is a man desperately in search of connection, living with the only genuine human, as far as we can tell, that he encounters in his everyday life, coming home and excitedly telling her, darling, I bought a new goat. And I think that is meant to be a little bit about men and their cars. And certainly there are bits in the book where, he sees a new model and there's a name, I can't remember what it is, for the catalogue that everyone flicks through to try and get a price for it. Because there's a lot about how you price these things. And it's a thing that we're all familiar with. The mark of authenticity is that it costs a lot, but we know that doesn't mean it's authentic. It just means it costs a lot. But human beings will believe that if something is really, really expensive, there's something more genuine about it than if it's cheap and mass produced. But it may all be on a spectrum. But he's not interested in bonding with his wife.
No, but I would speculate that perhaps it's not really about men's relationship with their cars, but about a world in which men's impulses to experience care are blocked and frustrated. And of course, that's a very contemporary critique. That has nothing to do with a post-apocalyptic world. That has to do with gender roles. And, as you said, I'm not sure exactly how progressive from the present standpoint Dick's attitudes about traditional gender roles were, although I suspect probably more progressive than the average at the time. But that being said, the inability of men to get social permission to feel care and express care is a theme that has been one in psychology and one in gender studies for a long time. And it is interesting that in the book, it is the men who seem to have not just the desire to use their animals as a calling card of status, although that is definitely there. But there's also this impulse to care for them and this need to have something to care for and nurture, but also a fear of caring and nurturing. So there's a scene that is relatively trivial in the book, and it's not in the film at all, involving a cat that Isidore finds, that Isidore initially thinks is a robot cat, and then it dies, and he can't find the switch. And he's like, oh my God, it was a real cat. And he ends up at some point on the phone, or he and his boss end up on the phone with the owner of the cat, or the wife of the couple who own the cat. And the wife talks about how important that cat is to her husband, how it's the most important thing in the world to him. Again, it's quite clear that the cat is probably more important to her husband than she is. But she also talks about, so they're talking about whether they can replace the cat with a fake. And they're like, well, no, look, he'll know instantly. And she says, no, he won't, because he won't get too close to the cat. It's the most important thing in the world. But because he believes the cat's real, he knows the cat is vulnerable, and he's afraid in some way of damaging it or something like that, or of hurting it. So he never gets so close to the cat that he'll notice if it's replaced with a facsimile. And yet, it's clear that the cat is much more important to her husband's emotional well-being than it is to hers. So yeah, there's this very strange narrative around care and gender that I was really fascinated by and kind of wanted to dive into further.
And I think it's fair to say that what Deckard wants from a goat, which means that a goat to him is preferable to a wife, is that it's the kind of care that doesn't involve a huge amount of worrying about the goat's emotional needs. It's a transactional form of care. And the main test of whether or not you're caring for your goat is, are you keeping it alive? And actually the goat dies, but it's a life or death thing. Mrs. Deckard, with her mood box, he's saying, dial this, dial that, dial the other. That's his way of saying, this is how I'm going to make sure you're okay. What he likes about the animals is it's very all or nothing, right? If it's alive, you're doing a good job. And if it's dead, you've failed. And it feels like the kind of notion of care, if care is even the word for it, which is appealing to extremely emotionally stunted human beings, which is what the men are in this story.
What the men are, but I also think there's some suggestion that it's really something that's happening to the entire human family. I mean, it's not like his wife seems to be doing particularly well emotionally. So I think the suggestion is that this is on a spectrum of emotional incapacity and decline, where men might be further down the slope in terms of their slide into a kind of emotional incapacity. But my sense from reading the book is the human women are right behind them on the slide.
And then something else that makes the story fascinating and complicated is that there is a third kind of actor or agent in this story. So the line is blurred between the humans and the androids, and the test has been developed to distinguish between them. And as you say, the test is always being gamed in a way by the androids. It reminded me a bit of, there's an advert that's doing the round at the moment on the radio, and I can't remember what it's for, so it's not a great advert in that respect, but it always makes me laugh. A woman goes into a shop and she wants to buy something, and the person behind the counter says to her, okay, but first of all, we're going to have to do a test to prove that you're not a robot. How many traffic lights can you see out of the window? And the woman says, well, 2. And the person behind the counter says, no, that's the wrong answer. And the woman says, right, but look, I'm obviously not a robot. And the woman says, yeah, but that's what a robot would say. And we're in the world of Do Androids Dream Electric Sheep, and it's an advert for something. So that's all going on. That there's the gaming, the empathy, which is flowing both ways. And then there is an entity which is the most unempathetic thing in the story, which is the corporation. So the Rosen Corporation that manufactures the androids, and which is described by Dick through the mind of Deckard as a kind of thinking thing. It's called a group mind in the book. There's an awareness that this thing doesn't just have agency, but it has an ability to think. It's a kind of thinking machine. But it is completely heartless. No one's going to mistake the corporation for a human being. And there are moments in the story where it feels like it's the heartlessness of the corporation that is driving the whole of the rest of the plot in a way. It's making these androids, it's trying to game the system, it's probably building the test and also building the machines that can defeat the test. And that to me also feels, I have to say, of all of the things in the book, very prescient.
Absolutely. And there's something that is, I think, I was curious what you thought about this aspect of the plot. There's the religion of Mercerism that is mediated through these empathy boxes that brings people into the presence of Mercer and his story, which is this sort of Sisyphean journey of constantly traveling up this rocky slope and being pelted by some unnamed enemies called the Killers. And the Mercer religion is very much about a sense of empathy with all organic life. So Mercerism is a commitment to solidarity, emotional solidarity and moral solidarity with other beings, other organic beings anyway. But there's this other cultural force, which is the TV show. It's this, media phenomenon that has apparently also become an incredibly pervasive cultural force. And everyone watches this show. And at one point in the story, right, it's clear that the Buster show is trying to undermine the force of Mercerism. And so you have this battle between these two forces, which are in some ways fighting for the soul of the humans in the middle. And I was curious whether you thought that the Rosen Corporation is meant to be seen as behind either or both of these things. Are they pulling the strings of Buster or of Mercerism? Is Mercerism some sort of way of pacifying humans' emotional needs and kind of keeping them content and sort of emotionally sated and passive? Or is Mercerism here supposed to represent some sort of true moral philosophy that is then being challenged and fought against by the kind of philosophy behind the Buster TV show? And where is the Rosen Corporation in this picture? I don't know. Did you think about these things at all?
Oh, yeah. I did think about them.
So you might have a theory.
I have a theory, which I'm aware is quite a pretentious theory, so I'm going to go for it anyway. So I think that I think he was definitely influenced by, as a lot of people who came out of American colleges in the 50s and 60s, by Frankfurt School thinking, which had been transplanted to the United States. And I think that the Buster show is meant to be a product of a kind of corporate media version of human pacification. That, this is the critique of Hollywood and of TV and of mass culture, that it is there to strip human beings of their individuality and play on some of their worst features, but also to kind of sedate them with excitement. And that's the classic Frankfurt School critique of mass commodified culture. I thought Mercerism was meant to be Christianity. And I didn't think that Mercerism was the product of the corporation. So I think the corporation builds the androids, and it builds an android-like culture where, can you tell who's human, who's not? Everyone's going to enjoy the Buster show. Everyone's going to enjoy it because it just plays on the parts of your brain that just respond to dopamine hits. It's not about empathizing with animals. It's just about like, bing, you've won a prize or whatever. But Mercerism, which is about suffering and empathy, I took it to be actually inspired by Nietzsche. And I'm pretty sure he has read Nietzsche at this point. And it reminded me actually of another book, which is Upton Sinclair's Oil, which became the basis of another great film, There Will Be Blood, which is definitely a Nietzschean book. And it's about the conflict between commerce and religion. But religion, understood as Nietzsche would understand it, as just another expression of human beings trying to console themselves for their powerlessness. And that's what I think Mercerism is. It's a religion, but it's the religion of the suffering human who needs something as consolation. So it's not real, it's sort of fake. And at one point, one of the characters says, Mercerism is fake, empathy is fake. None of this is real. You have to hold on to the machine to feel it. And yet it is the thing that human beings need, in the same way Nietzsche would say, most human beings suffer. And if you suffer, the religion that you're going to want is the religion that says, suffering is okay. In fact, suffering is, we're going to validate your suffering. We're going to glorify it in many ways. It's the religion of the weak. And so I take, in this brutal world, Mercerism to be the consolation that human beings find in a religion that they have created to console themselves for their impotence and their weakness. And past a certain point, it doesn't matter whether or not it's true. So I didn't think that they were both the products of the corporation, in the sense that Mercerism feels like a very human thing. So the Buster show and the androids and the heartless corporation gaming the system, that's where the real emptiness is. Mercerism it's just what human beings would create to console themselves. Here's our martyr figure being pelted with rocks. Here's our Christ figure. And in him, we can find fellow feeling. And yet, at some level, I think we're meant to read it as Nietzsche reads Christianity, as the thing that human beings have invented to console themselves. There you go. I told you it was a bit pretentious.
No, 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 no. No, I don't think it was pretentious. I think it's a little cynical. It may well be right, but there's one thing that made me, and I think you're right that Mercer, I mean, it's actually not a very subtle comparison with Christianity, right? This kind of martyrdom and Mercer's bleeding from being struck by these stones. And, so it's not too hard to see the link there. But there's this interesting aspect of the story where even after Mercerism and the show that is behind Mercerism has been exposed, so it turns out that Mercerism is in a way a show just as, something produced, as you say, an artifact, much like the Buster show is a show. So even after that's exposed, though, there's this weird thing where somehow Mercer's power doesn't disappear. And Mercer itself becomes something that appears in the physical world. I don't want to go into detail because it's also not clear exactly it's almost surreal. But Mercer appears to Deckard and other characters after this fact, and Mercer appears, and Mercer's world in some way appears fused with the real physical world. And Deckard at some point towards the end says, I fused with Mercer and now I can't unfuse. And so Mercerism has bled into the real world, even without the empathy box being there. So I almost wonder if it's also Dick thinking of the power of at least certain aspects of the message of Christianity to actually transform people, even if it's a story, even if it's something made up, that it has the power to actually shape humans and come into the world and transform it.
Yeah, and I think that's consistent with the theme of the book, which is the line between the fake and the real is just not a clear line at all. Any attempt to pin it down, you find yourself on both sides of it. And that would be true of Christianity. And it is consistent with the story of Christianity in the modern world, which is from the middle of the 19th century on. Some people would say it was revealed as a show. The deconstruction of Christianity from the historicizing of the life of Jesus through Nietzsche, through to 20th century secularism, is trying to explain this as a human artifact, religion as a human artifact. And many people believed, I think they particularly believed in the second half of the 20th century, that this would see it off. In the end, who's going to carry on believing in this thing once it's quite clear the ways in which it's just a construct? Well, it hasn't been seen off. And it's not just that it's, religion is still an incredibly powerful force in the world. Ironically, it's a very powerful force in Silicon Valley. At these points where it's thought that the hyper-rationalists are going to be the people who finally abandon religion first. And here we have Peter Thiel, just to name one person, who is simultaneously a cynical, I would say, power broker in Silicon Valley. And I would also say a genuine Christian.
I'm not going to go that far, but certainly animated by a certain religiosity. I'll give you that. And that religiosity of Silicon Valley, the kind of ideology of AI itself as a kind of new divine object is very clear. And this idea that somehow AI is the thing that is going to allow humanity to transcend its materiality, to transcend its constraints, to transcend its inefficiencies, to transcend our diversity and disagreements. This idea that AI is the thing that's going to actually save humanity from itself, that has become the new religion of much of Silicon Valley. And it's a very powerful narrative and a very dangerous one, I think.
And there's a connection with what we were talking about last time. So after our conversation about Asimov's franchise, I then read, which I'd not read before, the multivac story that Asimov said was his favorite, which is the one called The Last Question. And The Last Question is about how the story of multivac is going to end. So multivac becomes a more and more powerful, all-knowing, omniscient computer and weirdly gets bigger and bigger. And then eventually starts, he notices, but he thinks it'll happen in 10,000 years rather than in the 21st century. It then starts to shrink again. But it can answer everything except the one question it can't answer, which is when human beings say, but there is entropy in the universe, so eventually everything's going to burn out. The energy in the universe will burn out, the energy that runs you, the energy that runs us. So we can get smarter and smarter, more and more powerful, civilize more and more galaxies, but we can do nothing about entropy, which is the one fundamental law. So the question that Multivac is asked over and over again is there any way to reverse entropy? And Multivac always says, that's the one question I can't answer. And with the story takes us through billions of years and trillions of years, and humans merge with Multivac, and consciousness is everywhere in the universe. And there is not a human species. There's just one human. So like Norman Muller, his story comes true. There's just one person, and it is the universe. And it all gets very, very religious. And finally, Multivac answers the question at the end of the story of the universe. And I'm going to give it away. The last words are, let there be light. Turns out that Multivac is God. And there we go. That's the classic merging of a rationalist view of the universe with religion.
And I think what's really interesting is I think that Dick's narrative is a very powerful counter-narrative to that. Because at the end of the day, the story isn't about rationality at all. It plays almost no role. It suggests that what matters is emotion and moral feeling. And that matters more than the line between the human and the non-human, that it matters more than the line between the natural and the artificial. So for me, the book is about showing that these divisions at best are just proxies for the things that we really care about, which is the line between the sort of unfeeling mechanism, which may be human or not, and the feeling, experiencing being that can share feeling and experience with others. And that may be human or may not be. So the human, non-human line then becomes clearly, I think, one that at the beginning seems like the most important thing. But by the end, as you say, it's clear that that distinction is not just something that we're unable to draw. It's not just like, oh, this distinction really matters, but we just don't have the detection mechanisms to track it. That would be misunderstanding the book, I think. I think the book is about, this isn't the distinction at the end of the day that's meaningful. There's this other distinction about being a thing with agency and feeling and being something that is simply moved through an efficient series of procedures and that is optimized, if you will, for, a certain kind of performance. And what's remarkable about the replicants is they're not particularly, shall we say, warm and fuzzy characters. In keeping with many of the science fiction narrative, think all the way up to Westworld or Ex Machina, right? You've got these beings that can be incredibly cold and calculating and dispassionate towards humans and animals. They can kill without a second thought, and they seem in many ways brutal. But again, they're clearly characters that seem to have a sort of moral anger within them, a sense of having been wronged, of having been violated, that doesn't make sense for a mere machine. Why does a machine bother being angry about its oppression or its subjugation? So I think there's a notion here, which is, of course, something we can read through a political lens, say, hey, this isn't about machines at all. It's about the subjugation of different groups of people by other groups of people, the dehumanization of humans by other humans. And I think that reading is perfectly legitimate, too. Like, there's a reading of this book where the machines are just proxies here for the ways that we declassify some of us as fully human and deserving of moral concern, versus the view that our moral concern ought to be encompassing, and that there might be, in fact, legitimate, even violent resistance against subjugation and dehumanization. So I think there's a whole political reading of this that could take the machines out of the story and say, look, the machines here are just a proxy for the way humans treat humans. But I think there's also another reading of the story that's equally meaningful and valid, that's about the way in which what we care about is not the kind of matter that makes us up, but what that matter can do, and whether that matter can feel for one another. That's the message I wanted to take from the book. But like all great books, I think there are more than one message you can take from it, and different readers will take different things from it.
I feel at the end that Descartes has been grappling with, all through the book, with this dilemma, which is he's aware that if he feels, it'll be harder for him to do his job, because if he feels, he may end up feeling for the creatures that he has to kill. But if he doesn't feel, he finds it really hard to go on. And in a way, it's reminiscent of a kind of very different kind of fiction, the sort of the classic fiction of the British Empire in the early 20th century, sort of Somerset Maugham stories, or even George Orwell's writing about his own experiences as a military policeman in Burma. And exactly the same question. If I'm a feeling creature, I can't hold the line between the people I'm meant to care about and the people I'm not meant to care about. So I have to be an unfeeling creature. But if I'm an unfeeling creature, I find it really hard to live in this world. So I think that political reading absolutely is there. And at the end, there's a moral to this thing. It's like Descartes has come to acknowledge that he needs to feel to live. And if he's going to feel, he can't hold the line. And there's a world of creatures out there that runs from androids to lizards, and humans are somewhere in it. And he's not going to be able to hold the line between them.
And I think the recognition that there's this inhumane core to the way that we have organized our societies, such that we require people to sacrifice their humanity in order to defend it, that this is an unsustainable tension, and that eventually it breaks people or it breaks society. And so I think there's an implicit call here for, as there was in many books written during this period, and I would say in books that will be written in the next generation too, I think we're going to see a resurgence of this kind of narrative that sort of looks at the way that society is organized and the values that drive it, and basically say, look, here's where it ends. It ends in this impossible or undesirable state. So how do we organize a society that doesn't bring us to this point? Because I think that certainly the world that's described here is one that none of us would choose. And this is the old trope of science fiction is it going to show you a dystopia, or is it going to show you a world that you would choose? And clearly, this shows us a world that none of us would choose. So it invites us to ask the question, what other kind of world should we make?
I want to ask you one last question, and this one is about the film, because I'm sure many more people will have seen the film than read the book. And the most famous scene in the film is the little speech that the Rutger Hauer replicant character gives, which is known as the Tears in Rain speech. And it seems to speak to a lot of people. It's become a kind of motif in its own right. It's recited at funerals. People have it tattooed on them. It's a very short speech. I'm just going to read it for people who aren't aware of it. So this is what one of the replicants, as played by Rutger Hauer, says just before it, or he, dies. I've seen things you people wouldn't believe. Attack ships on fire off the shoulder of Orion. I watch sea beams glitter in the dark near the Tannhauser gates. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. Time to die. And that is not from the book. So that bit of the script wasn't in the book, and then Rutger Hauer rewrote it himself and improvised that speech. And it's the thing that's come to symbolize the film. Is it in keeping with the book? It seems to me it's in a very different kind of register. It's very sentimental, and humans relate to it. So humans relate to this android saying, when I go, all my memories go, which is a commonplace sentiment, and it seems to speak to people. I'm not sure it's in keeping with the book. I think the book is much more interesting than that speech.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, I think the speech just expresses something very different, something that's meaningful in another way, which is the kind of age-old struggle with mortality and impermanence. I mean, it goes back to the last question and entropy, right? We all not only want to live forever, we also want humanity and human culture to endure. And so when we think about the fact that, well, the heat death of the universe is not going to let that happen. And even the exhausting fantasies of billionaires who think that we're going to colonize Mars and then colonize other galaxies as a way of ensuring that, human culture doesn't die out. I think these narratives are expressions of that sort of deep-seated discomfort that we have with our own impermanence and the fact that we are encased in a world which is indifferent at the end of the day, a universe which is at the end of the day indifferent to our desire to live forever. So I think that's a very human feeling. And so, yes, it's sentimental. I understand why it strikes people emotionally in a very deep place. But I agree with you. I don't think it's what the book is about. I mean, one thing that the book really isn't about, in a way that a lot of stories about thinking machines are, is it's not about immortality. There's very little in the book that deals with that theme that I can think of, the kind of fact that we will all die. It's just not what the book is about. So I think the speech is a way of kind of taking the narrative and linking it to this kind of deeper philosophical and emotional resonance that our fear of death carries. But I kind of like the fact that the book doesn't actually pick that up at all.
And Mercerism, if it is Christianity, is also not Christianity because it offers suffering, but it doesn't offer eternal life. A reminder that if you'd like to hear the bonus episode that I recorded to go with this series about another truly great novel, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you can get it by signing up to PPF Plus. It's very easy. Just follow the link in the show description or go to ppfideas.com. And if you go to our website, you will also discover that we do now have some merchandise. We are offering an ethically sourced canvas tote bag in black and a bone china mug in white, both with the PPF logo on them. We think they look pretty good. We hope that you'll agree. And you can get them from our website or from the LRB's website. Take your pick. They are available now. Next time, on the history of thinking about thinking machines, books with a very different sensibility. Becky Chambers' Monk and Robot series, published in the last few years, a completely different vision of the robot future. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future, brought to you in partnership with the London Review of Books.